Lewis, Ed, Bobby, and Drew decide to canoe down the Kahalawasi River in the remote Georgia wilderness. From the start, it is clear the four are unfamiliar with the area. The redneck locals are crude, crass, unsophisticated, and unimpressed with the presence of outsiders. Drew briefly connects with a local mentally challenged banjo-playing boy by joining him in an improvised bluegrass jam. But when the song ends, the boy turns away without saying anything, refusing Drew's handshake. Lewis manages to negotiate with a family of local mechanics to drive their vehicles to a town downriver, where they will pick them up in 3 days. Afterwards, the four get into their 2 canoes, Lewis with Bobby and Ed with Drew, and paddle off. The men spend the day canoeing down the river and encounter some rapids and rough water, but they manage to row around them successfully. As sun goes down, they decide to spend the night at Riverside. Shortly before they retire for the night, Lewis tells the others to be quiet and disappears into the dark woods to investigate a sound he heard. He returns a few minutes later and says that he didn't find anything. The next morning, Ed wakes first and heads into the woods with his hunting bow. He sees a deer but unable to keep his aim straight and kill the deer, he fires and misses. He returns as the others are finishing breakfast and loading the canoes. Lewis tells Ed to take Bobby and go first. After a while, Bobby and Ed pull off to the side to wait, and encounter a pair of unkempt hillbillies emerging from the woods, one toothless, and one wielding a shotgun. The hillbillies come down and acts mildly hostile towards them. Bobby speculates that they have a whiskey still hidden in the woods and amicably offers to buy some, but the hillbillies immediately become angry. The 2 hillbillies tie Ed to a tree with his belt around his throat. The second hillbilly tells Ed to get on his knees. Ed notices Lewis sneaking up behind them through the trees with an arrow. He shoots and kills one hillbilly with the arrow through his back, as the other one is disarmed by Ed and quickly escapes into the woods. Lewis and Drew begin to argue with each other about whether to inform the authorities. While Drew wants to find a phone to call the police to report this, Lewis argues that they all would be arrested and not receive a fair trial. Lewis suggests to bury the dead hillbilly's body and continue as though nothing had happened. Everyone agrees. During the grave digging, Drew is obviously upset with the decision. After having buried the body, the four make a run for it down the river. Soon, disaster strikes as the canoes reach a dangerous area with rocks. In the lead canoe, Ed repeatedly asks Drew to wear his life jacket, but unnerved Drew ignores him without a word of explanation. A faint gunshot is heard and Drew falls forward into the river. Ed loses control of his canoe and both canoes collide on the rocks, spilling Lewis, Bobby, and Ed into the river. The 3 tumble down the river through the rapids and a waterfall. Lewis breaks his leg and the 2 others are washed ashore alongside him in a gorge under a massive cliff. The badly injured Lewis believes the toothless hillbilly shot Drew and is now stalking them. Later that night, under cover of darkness, Ed climbs the nearby rock face in order to dispatch the suspected shooter using his bow, while Bobby stays behind to look after Lewis. Ed reaches the top and hides out until the next morning. He sees a man standing on the cliff holding a rifle, looking down where Lewis and Bobby are hiding. Ed, despite being a champion archer, again freezes in spite of his clear shot. The man notices Ed and fires his rifle as Ed nervously releases his arrow. Ed falls to the ground in a panic and accidentally stabs himself with another arrow. The man stumbles toward Ed and is about to kill him when he drops his rifle and collapses, revealing Ed's arrow went through the back of his neck. Ed lowers the dead body down the cliff with a rope and climbs down after it. His rope breaks, and he and the dead body fall into the river. Ed swims ashore and meets with Bobby and Lewis. Ed and Bobby weigh the dead hillbilly down with stones and drop him into the river and then set out with the injured Lewis in the surviving canoe. A little later, they come upon Drew's corpse stuck in a corner. After being unable to find any definite gunshot wound on the dead Drew, they also weigh the body down with rocks and release it into the river. After canoeing through more rapids, Ed, Bobby, and Lewis finally reach their destination, the town of Aintree. They call the police and take the injured Lewis to the local hospital while sheriff arrives to investigate the incident. 2 days later, they are about to leave. Even though the sheriff is suspicious, he has no evidence as to what happened. He tells Ed, "I don't ever want to see you or your friends again," to which Ed readily agrees and drives away.